Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Nosferatu from 1922. And this is day one of my Halloween week of videos where I try to review 5 very different horror movies all leading up to Halloween. And this is kind of the perfect film to kick things off, as it is one of the oldest and most influential horror movies of all time. Nosferatu is the first major vampire silent film. There were 2 before, they're both lost. They don't seem to have been as big of a deal as Nosferatu. Those 2 was a Russian version of Dracula in 1920, and then Dracula's Death, which was a Hungarian film, which is also considered lost. But Nosferatu was never lost. They tried to, but Nosferatu lives on and has lived on for a very long time. Although this film is incredibly influential and probably almost everyone has seen kind of the final moments of Nosferatu walking up the stairs and the creepy silhouette, very German expressionistic kind of shot. And although this is kind of our introduction to vampires and what a lot of Dracula films would later be based on, the way they made this film is they wanted to make a kind of vampire type film, and they took the novel of Dracula, changed a bunch of names, and made a movie. And that's why it's called Nosferatu instead of Dracula. They certainly did change things adaptation-wise. It's very different from the kind of like lover Dracula character that we're kind of used to after Bela Lugosi. But the framework, and basically like while I was watching it, it felt very familiar as someone who saw the Horror of Dracula with Christopher Lee last year, which I reviewed. Even Bela Lugosi's Dracula I see fairly regularly. So when it came to Nosferatu and what they're doing with this plot, it felt like I was watching another version of Dracula. It's very close. In fact, close enough that Bram Stoker's widow sued them and won, and ordered in a court order every copy of Nosferatu be destroyed. To my understanding, they didn't even ask. I think they knew it was going to be a no, but they didn't ask, and so she had every copy destroyed. However, because this film was such a massive success, and because several of the prints have been copied, it lived on and was considered kind of one of the first cult movies, as many people's love for Nosferatu is what kept it around despite, a legal court order asking it to be stopped. And the power of this movie is quite interesting because it is very influential, because it does really live on. It has influenced even film versions that are authorized of Dracula. Now Dracula's now in the public domain, and they could, even when Herzog made his version of Nosferatu, they could just mention Dracula and do all that and it was fine. But it's interesting what F.W. Murnau, one of the greatest silent film directors, really did with his kind of unauthorized take on Dracula and made it into one of the more influential versions in how we understand both vampires and Dracula, starting off the new cinematic horror age. Thomas Hutter lives in a city in Germany, and his employer decides to send him to Count Orlok, who is a new client in the real estate game who wants to buy a house in that town. So he sends Thomas Hutter there to fill out the paperwork, and he goes and travels to Count Orlok's castle, finds from the various people that, he has a notorious reputation. They won't even take him all the way there. Then he's suddenly there and meets the mysterious Count Orlok, stays there overnight, kind of realizes there's something not quite right with him, particularly when he cuts his finger while cutting some bread, and then eventually realizes that he's a force of evil and maybe a vampire or a Nosferatu, because legally they can't actually say vampires in this movie. But Nosferatu is actually a term from Romania, I believe, and then they used it for this, but it was a previous term to basically mean a vampire. Finds that Nosferatu, or Count Orlok, is going to use his creepy mystical powers to come to the German town and start sucking people's blood. Although different from a vampire in like Dracula, he doesn't make people into vampires or something, he just kills them, and goes to a town in Germany, and Thomas Hutton must stop him as he has hypnotized his love Ellen and is eventually going to come for her and destroy his German town, and he has to try and stop them. It changes the various character names. Count Orlok is basically instead of Count Dracula, things of that nature, and it's fairly creative with it. But I really like the character of Nosferatu, or the character of Count Orlok. I guess they're the same person, so whatever. It's interesting how much it really sets up for the modern horror age, because despite this movie being named after Nosferatu, he's not in a lot of it. It's mainly about Thomas Hutter, and that's kind of the modern kind of thing about a horror movie villain, or, you know, even thinking of something like Jaws, or every great horror movie has a villain that's not in it that much, and this seems to be the beginning of that. Although this film is named after the character, although that's really what the film's all about, it makes it more impactful because you're not getting overloaded with this character. I think it adds a spookiness to it. Might add to the fact that I think the best performance is by Max Schreck, not like the character Sherrick, I think. Maybe I should just pronounce it Sherrick. I think because he's so captivating, the performance is absolutely amazing. It's probably one of the most iconic and amazing performances in film history, in that most people regard that character as like otherworldly. I mean, that's the whole reason they can make Shadow of the Vampire, where it's an actual vampire in Nosferatu, is the whole concept of that movie. And I think a lot of people, they think of that character, but they don't think of an actor there, which is some of your better actors who play monsters do, even like Lon Chaney and stuff. What he does here is just so otherworldly and strange, and he doesn't have a determined sexuality at a time when that was very confrontational and scary to people. He doesn't seem to mind, you know, sucking the blood of a man or a woman. He has a rat-like appearance. A lot of stuff to do in this film, more to do with like the plague, which is not in the original Dracula story, with a plague that he's brought over with him to this German town. And Spanish flu hadn't been that long ago. Everyone had just gone through World War I. Flus and plagues were actually still common less than 100 years ago, believe it or not. We haven't had one in a while. Hopefully we don't have another one, but it was probably a kind of too close for home type of imagery that most people could understand was very much part of their world, much like how, you know, Man of Steel has too much 9/11 imagery, Nosferatu has a lot of plague imagery, and people could probably relate to it more. That's probably what scared them, is that it isn't a plague, it's this demonic, crazy rat-looking creature, much like the rats who actually gave them the plague. So that kind of design, you have to really look at some of these designs and these characters and kind of understand where it's coming from in the time that it's being made in. And Nosferatu is very much culturally so different than we are now. It looks more otherworldly, but to them it probably looked demonic or satanic. The design is so perfect, it can be any one of those. It just doesn't seem human in a lot of ways. It kind of really shows that vampires are evil. And Max Sherrick, or Shrek, or whatever, he really does a number on this film in such a way that you almost just look at it as a character and you don't look at an actor being there. I'm not a huge fan of Thomas Hutter and Gustav Guggenheim. Ellen I like a little more, Greta Schroeder, and some of the other performances, but mainly for me, Count Orlok or Nosferatu steals the show, frankly. I loved F.W. Murnau. This was the film that really, one of the films, this and The Last Laugh, that really catapulted the success of those films, really catapulted him to stardom and let him come to Hollywood. I believe he moved to Hollywood in the later 20s. This was a worldwide success. It was a major, major film, and that helped him become known and be able to make something like Sunrise, which I think is one of the greatest silent films, and probably one of the greatest films of all time. This has never been one of my favorites. I think I prefer, like, if I'm going to go into a horror Murnau thing, I'd much rather recommend Faust. I think the imagery is so much better in Faust. He definitely does some really interesting stuff in here, especially for the time period, but he does a lot of stuff that, like, some things and innovations in film are interesting and amazing at the time, but some last the test of time and they're still interesting. Like, look at Battleship Potemkin. Those sequences are still great. But in Nosferatu, some are rather lamer, some are simpler but beautiful. The shadow of the step sequence, I'm never going to dispute how iconic and how amazing that is. It is kind of like German expressionistic. I don't want to say this is as expressionistic as like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which really goes into that, and there are other examples of that. I think only in certain shots you really see that in Nosferatu. This isn't as expressionistic as I think a lot of people act like it is. It is around that time, so sure, but there are certain shots definitely that you can see that influence. He does a lot of things, like the stop motion stuff in this is interesting. It feels very homey. This feels like a small movie. Apparently they only had one camera, so apparently it was a very smallly made movie. That has never like felt as universal to me. I like how Murnau uses the natural sets, like the doorways he has Count Orlok walk through, the way he has Orlok move. Even the stop motion effects in this probably felt creepier and stranger at the time, and that leads to like he can control time and things of that nature. Even when who I assume is Orlok, who picks up Hutter and takes him in the carriage to the castle, even that sequence feels bizarre. But then when he does like the reverse negative effect, it probably felt really shocking and different at the time. But watching it now, and I'm not trying to be like, you know, laugh at special effects of the period, but it just didn't feel as interesting. I was kind of like, okay, I mean, I guess. I think Murnau gets a lot out of kind of a smaller budget. Clearly, when he's working with a larger budget, he's a lot better. It seemed like at the time he was listening a lot to the screenplay, so I don't know how much directorial voice he really had over this film, but apparently he did storyboard certain sequences, specifically the staircase sequence and certain sequences, and he did kind of override and try to do his own thing, and I think when he eventually did, those films were a lot better for it. I've never really felt this is one of his better films. It's just the film he is most known for because of the shadow it basically leaves on everything. And I love how he uses that shadow, like when you see the hand come out and grab her heart. The blocking in it is amazing, just the poeticness of it, and certain shots in this, like when Ellen is looking out the sea, was just absolutely stunning. And there's certain shots that are really great, probably because I saw Nosferatu after seeing Sunrise and The Last Laugh. It's never really been one of my favorites. I think had I seen it probably in the right order, I probably would have gotten more into it. And I really don't like the character of Hutter at all. I know in Dracula they get rid of that character fairly quickly, and in this they keep him around, and I kind of agree with how everyone else did it. I don't like that character. They're not very captivating. They're fairly annoying. It's best to just get that character done with and move on with the story. It manages to work because of what they're doing with Nosferatu or Captain Orlok. I kind of am switching between the two, unfortunately. I'm sorry. So this was actually the only film made by Piranha Film, which was founded in 1921 by Enrico Dickmann and an occultist and artist Albin Groh, and they named it after the Buddhist concept of Piranha. They wanted to produce occult and supernatural films, but this is the only film they made because they had to file for bankruptcy because of the lawsuit, and they had to close down. So they only made one film, but I'm sure there are studios who've made 200 films that did not have the impact that Nosferatu did. The thing about Nosferatu, and I guess I am shitting on it a little bit, I like what it's saying for the time. I like what they do with what they have to work with the stop motion effects, with making a creepy kind of demonic horror creature that some of the imagery just sticks with you. It haunts you. I don't think there's anything in here that's horrific, but the haunting nature of it is something you can't escape. And thinking about a plague and thinking about how it's using that imagery and how it influenced all these horror stories, from not showing the villain too much to using something that's horrifying us at the time to really bring this monster more to life and make it more relatable. That would go on to, creatures being from the atomic age to, the 70s. You can really see a through line through history and film history and horror movies and what's going on in the world. And I think this shows at a time where, a plague could take out you and your whole village. Thinking a demonic, crazy rat kind of creature could do that was very real to you. And I don't think this film lost that. I think this film has been able to infect everything. I think, obviously vampires change movie to movie, but the core belief of a vampire or a Nosferatu type creature is that it would bring death and was this horrible demon who had no morals and wouldn't go by Christian rules. And I think that's what makes the Nosferatu character and a vampire so horrifying, is because it will move in ways that we can't even understand, moving in stop motion, moving in like a reverse negative effect. And it seemed like Murnau tried to do that in the best way he possibly could. And I think this film definitely succeeds. F.W. Murnau is such a master of cinema. Like, he really is. He's really one of the great silent film directors. And Nosferatu, although I will say I do not think you should stop at Nosferatu. If this is how you're going to go into F.W. Murnau, it's not a bad place to be. It's a very captivating film. It's a very interesting film. It moves in a certain way. And it's interesting how he chose, or how really everyone involved in this film chose to adapt Dracula and make it into something like this. If you've seen various versions of Dracula, it is a very interesting adaptation. And I think it does a lot with people's conceived notions of evil, and those conceived notions of evil ended up being a lot more universal than just in 1922, because it actually didn't even get released until America until 1929 and was a sensation. And I think it says a lot about F.W. Murnau as a director, that he's been able to have iconic moments with the shadow going up the staircase that would keep going on, and even be in, it's in the Under Pressure video by David Bowie and Queen. It's probably a sequence that almost everybody knows, and it's not even till the end of the movie, and that speaks very highly of this film. I think it's a very beautiful, sad film about incoming terror, because it's not romantic. It's not trying to show you the seduction of an evil force. I think it's better to watch for its influence than it is maybe for its quality, but you're not going to be disappointed by a film like Nosferatu, and it's very hard to be disappointed by F.W. Murnau. It's still a very good entry in his filmography, and it's a very good movie, and it shows the iconic imagery that he would later end up doing with things like Faust and Sunrise. You're starting to see the kind of buds bloom into becoming the giant titan of cinema that he would become, but in some people's eyes, and in probably influence-wise, this was his giant leap artistically that would infect cinema for ages and ages, and I don't think we're ever probably going to get rid of it, which probably shows both the power of F.W. Murnau and the power of Nosferatu, whether I like it or not. So if you have seen Nosferatu and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And come back tomorrow for day 2 of 5 of my Halloween week of videos, all leading up to Halloween. Thank you very much for watching, and have a happy Halloween.